On a quiet, snowy night, an old man spotted a starving dog digging through trash behind his shop. Something in its eyes stopped him cold. He offered it food, but what followed led to a battle, a courtroom, and a truth that would shake the entire town. Why did this broken animal return, and what past was it running from? Max, a stray dog, whose thin frame trembled in the biting wind, limped along the frozen streets of a small, quiet town, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was sharp, laced with frost, and the ground beneath his paws felt like shards of glass. His ribs pressed against his matted fur with every breath, and each step seemed to take every last ounce of strength he had left. Max didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stop. The cold gnawed at him, but hunger was an even crueler enemy, twisting in his belly like a fist. He passed shuttered windows and silent doorways, the scent of dinners wafting from behind warm walls that didn't belong to him. He had learned long ago that people rarely welcomed a dog like him. Once, long ago, he'd known warmth and kindness, a bed and a name spoken with love. But those memories had faded, buried beneath pain, fear, and a past that haunted him. Max didn't search for affection anymore, only survival. He had no collar, no home, and no hope, but instinct drove him forward. As he rounded a corner, he came upon a narrow alley bathed in the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. At its end sat a dented green dumpster, overflowing with discarded scraps and the smell of rot. To most, it would be disgusting. To Max, it was a chance to live another day. He crept forward, his body low, ears flattened, tail tucked tightly beneath him. Every sound, every rustle, every car in the distance sent his heart racing. He had been chased before, beaten for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he was too tired to care now. He sniffed carefully, pawing through greasy wrappers, dried bones, and half-eaten bread crusts. His breath formed clouds in the frozen air, each puff a reminder he was still alive, if only barely. Across the street, behind the glass of a modest corner shop, a man stood watching. Joe, the shopkeeper in his 70s, had just finished closing up for the night. The bell above the door had stopped ringing, and the last customer was long gone. He was wiping down the counter when he spotted the movement outside. At first he thought it was a shadow. Then he saw Max, skinny, filthy, but moving with a strange kind of grace. Joe stepped closer to the window and squinted through the frost. Something about the dog struck him. It wasn't just the hunger, or the dirt, but the look in the dog's eyes, haunted, but not wild, afraid but not broken. Joe had lived a quiet life since losing his wife. No children, no family nearby, just the shop, the routine, and the silence. But something stirred in him as he watched the dog sniff through the trash. Maybe it was the way Max didn't fight off other scavengers, or bark at passing cars. Maybe it was the way he paused now and then, looking around like he expected danger at any moment. Joe couldn't quite say what it was. All he knew was that he couldn't look away. He walked behind the counter and picked up a leftover piece of roast chicken he'd been saving for himself. Without thinking twice, he walked to the door, stepped into the cold, and called out softly, "Hey there, buddy, you hungry?" Max froze, his body tensed, eyes locked on the man, legs ready to bolt. The voice was gentle, not loud or threatening. Joe stayed still, crouched down, and gently placed the chicken on the ground a few feet away. Then he backed up, and waited. Max didn't move at first. His instincts screamed for him to run, but the smell was too much, and the man wasn't moving closer. Slowly, painfully, Max took a step forward. His eyes never left Joe's face as he lowered his head and sniffed the food. It wasn't a trap, it was real, warm, fresh. His stomach growled as he swallowed the first bite. Joe watched quietly, barely breathing. The old man's eyes welled with something he hadn't felt in years. A kind of purpose. In that quiet, frozen alley, two souls found each other, not through words, but through silence and shared loneliness. One had lost everything to the cold world outside, the other had lost everything to the silence within. But on that night, they met in the middle,
both needing something the other didn't even realize they had to give. Joe didn't try to pet Max, he didn't try to coax him closer, he simply whispered, "It's okay boy, you're safe now," and walked back inside, leaving the door unlocked just in case. Max licked the last bit of grease from the bones, and looked toward the door. For the first time in years, he didn't run away. He sat, he waited, and Joe watched from the shadows, heart pounding, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something neither of them had known they needed.
Joe stood quietly on the steps of his corner shop, the chill of the evening clinging to his old coat, but he hardly noticed. His focus was entirely on the trembling dog, just across the street. He had seen strays before, dozens over the years, but this one was different. There was something in the way the dog moved, not just hunger, but caution, not just survival but memory. The dog's fur was a mess, a patchwork of dirt, knots and scars, and his ribs showed plainly through his thin sides. But what caught Joe most were his eyes, deep, dark, watching everything, like a creature that had been hurt too many times to trust, yet hadn't given up completely. Joe had once known that look. After his wife passed, the silence in his home grew louder than any noise. The world had kept spinning, but he hadn't. He went to work, kept the lights on, stocked the shelves, but he hadn't truly connected with another soul in years. As he watched the dog nose around the trash, something stirred in him, a quiet ache, familiar and sharp. Joe stepped back inside his shop, and looked at the counter. There sat a piece of roast chicken he had planned to eat for dinner. It wasn't much, but he didn't hesitate. Wrapping it in a napkin, he stepped back outside. The cold bit at his face, and his knees ached with every step, but he made his way across the road slowly, so as not to startle the dog. The dog Max, though Joe didn't know his name yet, froze as soon as Joe appeared. His body went rigid, and his eyes locked on Joe, with the kind of fear that only came from experience. Joe's heart twisted. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You hungry?" He crouched down slowly, each movement measured, and gently placed the chicken on the pavement between them. Then, without another word, he stepped back. The dog didn't move right away. The seconds stretched out as Max stood still, torn between hunger and fear. His muscles were tense, his tail low, but his nose quivered, catching the scent of warm meat. Joe didn't move, he simply stood there, letting the dog decide. Finally Max took a cautious step forward, then another. His body stayed low, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. He reached the chicken, sniffed it once, twice, and then, driven by hunger, stronger than fear, began to eat. Joe watched in silence, his hands tucked in his pockets to keep from reaching out. He wanted to pet the dog, to say something more, but he knew better. Trust wasn't built in a moment. He'd seen enough hurt in his life to understand that healing takes time. As Max ate, he kept glancing up at Joe, his eyes never staying long but always returning, as if trying to decide if the man was safe. Joe simply gave a small smile and said, "It's all right, boy. I'm not going anywhere." When the chicken was gone, Max backed away, still watching, but he didn't run. He just stood there, unsure. Joe slowly stepped back toward his shop. He didn't call the dog. He didn't make any promise. He just left the door open for a few minutes longer than usual, then stepped inside, and closed it gently. That night, Joe couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those eyes, about how they softened just a little when Max realized the food was a gift, not a trick. He remembered the way the dog's body stopped shaking, just for a moment, while he chewed, and more than anything, he remembered how it felt to do something that mattered, even just a small kindness. The next morning, Joe woke early. He set out another bit of food behind the shop, just in case. He didn't know if the dog would come back. Maybe it had just been a passing moment, but part of him hoped, and that hope, fragile and warm, was something he hadn't felt in years. Max did return. That evening, Joe spotted him again, lingering at the alley's edge, eyes alert, nose in the wind. Joe said nothing. He just stepped outside, and set down another meal. The dog waited,
then approached, more quickly this time, still careful, still distant, but not quite as afraid. Over the next few days, the ritual repeated. Max began to understand that this man with the quiet voice and tired eyes meant no harm. Joe never reached for him, never pushed, never asked for trust. He just showed up, every night, with a little food and a little warmth. And Max in turn showed up too. He began staying a bit longer each night. After eating, he'd sit a few feet away, not close enough to touch, but close enough to listen, as Joe talked to him. Joe would sit on the back step, his breath misting in the cold air, telling stories about his late wife, about the town, about nothing in particular, just to fill the space between them with sound, something gentle and familiar. Slowly, Max's eyes changed. They lost a bit of the wildness. His tail, once hidden beneath him, started to lift. One evening, as Joe placed the bowl down and turned to sit, Max didn't wait for the man to retreat. He walked forward and began to eat, before Joe was even fully settled. Joe stayed very still, watching out of the corner of his eye. When Max finished, he didn't run. He lay down, right there, a few feet away, resting his chin on his paws. Joe didn't speak. He just sat, letting the silence between them feel like comfort, rather than emptiness. That night, Joe left an old blanket by the shop's back wall, folded neatly. The next morning it was rumpled, with a few paw prints in the dust nearby. Joe smiled to himself, said nothing, and left the blanket out again. This was not a fast friendship. It was slower than that, but that was the beauty of it. Day by day, moment by moment, the old man and the broken dog found something they hadn't known they still needed. Connection. For Max it was the first real kindness in a very long time. For Joe it was the first time he felt less alone. In each other they saw something familiar. Pain, yes, but also survival. They had both lost things they couldn't get back, but maybe, just maybe, they had found something new. Joe started leaving the shop door slightly ajar in the evenings. Sometimes Max would peek in, sometimes he would stay outside, but the distance was shrinking. And one quiet night, as snow began to fall, Max stepped just inside the doorway, not far, just a few feet, but far enough. Joe looked up from his chair, met the dog's eyes, and gave a small nod. "Welcome, boy," he said softly. "Stay as long as you like."
From that first night, something shifted, not just for Max the stray dog, but for Joe, the quiet old man with kind eyes and an aching heart. The ritual they had begun, Joe leaving out food, Max accepting it with hesitation, continued every evening as winter deepened around them. Joe didn't mind the cold anymore. Each time he saw the dog's silhouette in the alley's soft glow, something warm stirred in his chest. He would set out a bowl of food and step back into the shadows, watching with quiet hope as Max emerged from the darkness like a ghost, uncertain of being seen. At first, Max would eat and disappear again, slipping back into the night, like a memory fading before morning. But after a few nights, something changed. Instead of vanishing immediately after finishing his meal, Max would linger, just for a few minutes. He'd sit near the empty bowl watching Joe from a distance, his ears alert but relaxed, his tail still but no longer tucked between his legs. Joe understood that this was progress. It wasn't affection yet, but it was a question, one Max was beginning to ask silently. "Can I trust you?" Joe never forced the answer. He simply spoke in his low, gentle voice, talking about nothing in particular. He talked about the weather, about the customers at the shop, about his late wife, and the way she used to sing while sweeping the kitchen floor. He knew Max didn't understand the words, but he hoped the dog could understand the tone, the calm, the care, the patience. That was the gift Joe could offer: time, space, and kindness, without expectation. And Max, in his own way, began to respond. His visits became more regular. He started arriving before the food was even set out, waiting quietly in the corner of the alley, as if to say, "I'm here." On the fifth night, Joe sat on the back steps with the food bowl beside him, not in front of the dumpster like usual. Max hesitated,
his body frozen in that half-step stance of fear and longing. Joe didn't move. He simply gave a soft chuckle and said, "It's closer to the porch tonight, boy. You don't have to take it if you don't want to." For a long moment, Max stood still. Then, almost imperceptibly, he walked forward, slow and unsure. He paused again just a few feet away, looked Joe in the eyes, and then crept closer to the bowl. The old man held his breath, heart pounding, not from fear, but from awe. Max was choosing him, even if only a little at a time. When Max began eating, his eyes flicked up to Joe every few bites. Joe didn't reach out, he just whispered, "That's it. Good boy, you're safe." After that night, Max's walls began to crumble, not all at once, but in the small ways that only someone watching closely could notice. He no longer bolted at sudden noises. He didn't flinch when Joe opened the door. Instead, he started laying down near Joe's chair during evening talks, resting his head on his paws and closing his eyes, if only for a few seconds. The alley became less of a hiding place and more of a meeting ground. Joe added a second blanket near the food bowl, and to his quiet joy, Max began sleeping there. It wasn't shelter yet, but it was a start. One snowy evening, Joe sat on the steps, sipping warm tea, his knees stiff, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Max lay just a few feet away, his fur speckled with snowflakes, his body relaxed for the first time in Joe's memory. The wind howled, but there was peace in that tiny corner of the world. Joe glanced over and softly said, "I don't know what you've been through, but I'm here now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." As if responding to that promise, Max lifted his head and looked at Joe, not with suspicion but with something gentler, maybe even gratitude. It was then, in the quiet of falling snow and whispered words, that Max stood, took a single step forward, and lowered his nose. Joe remained perfectly still, his hand, gloved and trembling slightly, stayed outstretched. Max leaned in, sniffed, and after a long pause, pressed his nose into Joe's palm. The touch lasted only a second, but it was everything. Joe didn't speak, he just smiled, eyes misty, and let his hand stay there in the cold air, long after Max stepped back. It was the first touch Max had allowed in years. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a decision. Joe knew better than to rush the moment. That single second of contact carried more weight than 1,000 words. From that point on, their relationship deepened. Max followed Joe to the edge of the shop when he opened up in the mornings, sat near the delivery crates, and watched customers come and go. He still didn't like to be pet. He didn't lick Joe's hand, or wag his tail like a normal dog, but he was there, and being there mattered. Joe started calling him by name. "Max," he would say gently, "want to go for a walk?" At first, Max wouldn't respond. Then one day, he stood and followed. They walked slowly down the lane, side by side, no leash, no expectations, just an old man and a dog who had both lost too much, learning how to share space again. Joe began sleeping better at night. He checked the blanket out back before going to bed, smiling when he saw Max curled up. And every morning, Max was still there, waiting with quiet eyes and a calm presence that made the loneliness in Joe's heart feel a little less sharp. Max never asked for love, he never begged for attention, but in his silent loyalty, in the small ways he stayed close. He gave Joe a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up and keep going. They healed each other, not through grand gestures, but through the daily rhythm of quiet trust. And so, the man who once spoke only to passing customers, now found himself talking every evening to a dog who never spoke back, but who listened with more understanding than most people ever could.
As the winter deepened and the nights grew colder, Joe began to worry more about Max. Though the dog came every evening for food and stayed nearby for hours, he still refused to come fully indoors. He remained outside, keeping a quiet distance, even when the temperatures dropped dangerously low. Joe knew that Max's pride and instincts made him wary of small spaces indoors, and he respected that. But he couldn't just stand by and let the dog sleep out in the snow. So one morning, after Max had wandered off before dawn, Joe stepped out behind the shop, with a thick blanket, an old quilt his late wife had sewn years ago. It was frayed and faded at the corners, but still warm. He laid it gently in the sheltered corner, where Max usually curled up, next to the crate of old newspapers he used to rest against. Joe also placed a worn pillow beside it, and tucked the edges of the blanket down, creating a makeshift bed, humble but thoughtful. That night, Max returned as he always did, and Joe simply nodded toward the new bed, and whispered, "It's for you, boy, just in case you're tired of the concrete." Max didn't approach it right away. He sat near the food bowl as usual, eyes darting between Joe and the new addition. He sniffed the air, cautious, hesitant, but after he'd eaten, something in him seemed to soften. Slowly, quietly, he walked over to the pile of blankets, circled once, then twice, and finally lay down. Joe watched from the back step, his hands tucked under his arms for warmth, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't say anything more. He knew better than to interrupt this moment. That night, Joe went to bed with a strange feeling in his chest. Not excitement exactly, but something close to peace. He peered out the back window before turning off the lights, and there was Max curled up on the quilt, his chest rising and falling slowly under the moonlight. From then on, the quilt bed became Max's spot. No matter how bitter the air grew, he returned to that corner each night, and lay on the same soft fabric, his body gradually relaxing over time. Joe began adding little comforts, a bowl of water, a small tarp to keep the snow from blowing in, and eventually a second blanket for the coldest nights. Every addition was made with quiet care, never forced, always gentle. Joe never tried to coax Max indoors or pick him up. He let Max have control of the space, and in return, Max gave him his presence. Though the dog still flinched at fast movements, and never allowed himself to be touched, he never ran away anymore. He stayed through storms, through howling winds, through nights when even the town's stray cats disappeared into shelters. Max stayed because something had changed, not in the world, but between them. Joe, for his part, found himself rearranging his life around those small moments of companionship. He began locking up the shop earlier so he could sit on the back step with a cup of coffee and talk to Max while the dog lay nearby. He told stories about his younger days, about how he and his wife used to walk the lake trail before it dried up. He shared memories of the little boy he'd once mentored through a church program, a boy who had since moved far away. Max never interrupted, never answered, but he listened. His ears perked at the sound of Joe's voice, and his eyes, those eyes that had once been so guarded, seemed to soften just a little more each day. Joe didn't feel alone when Max was there. Even when they sat in silence, even when snow fell around them like dust from the sky, there was something in the stillness that made Joe feel loved even, and yet, he never expected anything in return. That's what made Joe different from others. Max had known. There were no commands, no ropes, no cages, just kindness, slow and steady. Joe gave love the way some people give water to a dying plant, a little at a time, not expecting it to bloom but hoping it might. And Max, in his quiet way, received. He let it in slowly, carefully, like a trickle of warmth through a crack in a frozen wall. On mornings when Joe opened the back door and saw Max stretched out on the blankets, he would smile, nod and say softly, "Morning, buddy." Sometimes Max would lift his head in greeting. Sometimes he'd stay asleep, tail flicking gently at the sound of Joe's voice. But always, he stayed close. Over time, a new routine formed. Joe started walking the alley before opening the shop, calling softly, "You around, Max?" If the dog wasn't there, Joe worried. But Max always came back, sometimes with snow on his back, sometimes limping slightly from a hard night, but always returning. Joe began setting food and water out, even in the daytime. Occasionally Max would rest in the sunlight, near the loading dock, his body relaxed, eyes half closed. People passing by would ask about him. "Is that your dog?" they'd say. Joe would smile and shake his head gently. "Not mine," he'd answer. "He's just here." But deep inside, Max was becoming his dog, and Joe was becoming his person. Not through ownership, but through trust, built one patient day at a time.
One day, when a snowstorm hit unexpectedly and Joe stayed late to shovel, Max didn't leave. He stayed beside the shop wall through the night, nestled in his blankets while the wind howled and the snow piled high. Joe watched through the back window, heart aching with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity, it was something more, gratitude perhaps. The dog had chosen to stay, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he felt safe. And Joe, in all his loneliness, had never felt more needed. That night, before bed, he opened the back door once more, stepped into the cold and laid a second pillow down near Max's head. He didn't try to pet him, didn't speak loudly, just knelt nearby and whispered, "Thank you, Max, for staying. You don't know what that means to me." And for the first time Max didn't open his eyes or lift his head. He just stayed sleeping, breathing slow and even, as though Joe's presence, even so close, was no longer something to fear. In that quiet, snowy corner behind an aging shop, two lives continued to grow around each other, one kind act at a time.
Max had not always been a stray, wandering alone through frozen streets and sleeping behind dumpsters. Once, a long time ago, he had belonged to someone. His name hadn't always been whispered through alleyways, or spoken gently by a kind old man. Once it had been shouted with joy by a young man named Alan, who had adopted Max as a puppy. In those early days, Max had lived in a small but warm apartment, surrounded by soft cushions, cheerful voices, and the scent of fresh food. Alan had been a kind person back then, gentle, playful, full of laughter. Max had loved him without question, the way only dogs can, with every wag of his tail and every trusting glance. They had gone on long walks together, played fetch in the yard, and fallen asleep side by side on the couch. Max had believed he was safe, that the world was good. But life has a cruel way changing people. When Alan lost his job after the company shut down, everything began to unravel. At first it was small things, the missed meals, the heavy sighs, the angry muttering. Then came the shouting, the slammed doors, and the long silences filled with tension. Max didn't understand why his once loving owner had started pulling away. He still greeted Alan at the door, with a wagging tail, still lay beside his bed at night, still offered comfort in the only ways he knew how. But Alan stopped noticing. The job search turned into desperation. Desperation turned into drinking, and drinking turned into rage. Max became the nearest target. He didn't understand the slaps, the kicks, the days he went without food. He would sit by the empty bowl, his stomach growling, his eyes on the door, waiting for the man who used to love him to return to the way he was. But that man never came back. Over time, Max's body changed. His fur lost its shine, his eyes grew dull. The happy, bouncy pup became a ghost of himself, moving slowly, flinching at raised hands, hiding under furniture when Alan's footsteps echoed through the halls. He never barked, never growled, never fought back. He just endured, because dogs, in their deepest nature, are loyal, even to those who hurt them, even when it breaks them. One night, after a particularly brutal outburst, Alan threw a bottle across the room. It shattered against the wall, and Max, cornered and trembling, knew he couldn't stay any longer. Something in him, some last piece of instinct that hadn't been crushed, told him to run. So, when the door was left ajar, Max bolted out into the cold, into the unknown. He didn't stop to look back. He ran until his legs ached and his lungs burned. That night, the stars above watched silently as a once loved dog fled the only home he had ever known. The streets were hard, the alleys were cruel, food was scarce, people were unkind, but Max was free. And even though his body bore the marks of what he had endured, scars on his legs, ribs that stuck out from starvation, a limp from a kicked joint, his spirit somehow still carried a spark. He never barked at strangers. He never chased other animals. He simply moved through the world, like a shadow, searching for something he didn't have words for. Not food, not shelter, but peace. And when he found Joe,
He didn't know what to make of it. A man who didn't yell, who didn't raise a hand, who left out food without demanding anything in return. Max had been taught not to trust, yet something inside him whispered that this man was different. Joe never asked where Max came from. He never questioned the scars, or the way Max sometimes whimpered in his sleep. He didn't flinch when Max growled at loud noises, or jerked away from sudden movements. Joe simply existed beside him, offering quiet companionship and understanding, without needing explanations. The truth was, Joe had his own ghosts. He too had lost things he didn't speak about, and maybe that's why he never pried. Maybe he understood that healing doesn't begin with questions, but with patience. So Max began to settle, not because he forgot his past, but because Joe didn't ask him to. Instead, Joe let him carry it, the way old men carry their memories in silence, visible only in the way they move, the way they pause before speaking, the way they stare too long at nothing at all. Over time, the distance between man and dog narrowed. Not physically, they still didn't touch much, but emotionally, Max no longer trembled at every sound. He no longer ran when the back door creaked open. He began to believe, little by little, that maybe not every hand would strike, not every night would be filled with fear. Still, the past lived inside him. There were days when Max would wake up suddenly, heart racing, tail tucked, breath coming fast. On those days Joe wouldn't speak. He would just sit on the step, letting Max know he wasn't alone. Other times, Max would growl low when certain footsteps passed by the alley, or he'd disappear for a full day, and return dirty and exhausted, as if chasing away ghosts only he could see. Joe never scolded him. He just made sure the food was warm when Max came back. And slowly, something rare and sacred began to bloom. A bond, not built on affection alone, but on survival, shared space, and silent understanding. Joe began calling him Max, not because he knew the name, but because it felt right. A name with strength, a name to remind the dog, and himself, that even broken things can be made whole again. Max never barked at Joe. He never wagged his tail wildly, but when Joe walked outside, Max's eyes followed him with quiet loyalty. That Joe knew was more powerful than any tail wag or sloppy lip. It was trust earned, not given. Joe didn't know who Alan was, or what exactly had happened to Max before he showed up in that alley, but he didn't need to. He saw it in the way Max flinched at certain sounds, the way his body still moved cautiously, the way he sometimes whimpered in his sleep. Joe didn't need a story to offer love. He just needed to show up, and he did, every single day. That was Joe's gift. No pressure, no expectations, just the open door, the warm food, the quiet voice, and the steady hand. And in that consistency, Max began to heal, not by forgetting, but by learning to live again in the presence of someone who asked nothing from him, except that he stay, and stay he did. Because sometimes when the past haunts you, what you need most isn't to run from it, but to have someone beside you while you face it. And in Joe, Max had found that someone.
It was a bright, quiet morning in early spring. The kind that brings a gentle warmth after months of bitter cold. The snow had melted, and the sidewalks were damp with patches of earth finally showing beneath. Joe had started taking Max on short walks, always to the quieter parts of town, where the streets were lined with bare trees, old fences, and memories tucked into every corner. It had taken months for Max to feel safe enough to walk beside Joe, and even then, he remained alert, never straying far, always checking his surroundings. Joe never forced him. He let Max set the pace, let him choose the path. That morning, they walked a familiar stretch near the edge of town, where the houses grew sparse and the fields opened wide. Birds sang quietly in the trees, and for the first time in a while, Max's steps seemed light. Joe looked down at the dog, noting the way his tail swayed gently, and how his ears were perked, not in fear, but in curiosity. It was a good day, but peace, as Joe knew too well, could be fragile. As they rounded a quiet bend in the road, Max suddenly stopped, not paused, stopped, completely frozen. His body stiffened, his eyes locked forward, his entire frame tense, like a coiled spring. Joe followed Max's gaze and saw a man walking toward them. He was dressed in a dirty coat, his shoes mismatched, and his face partly hidden under a hood, but something about him made Joe's heart sink. There was something off in the way the man moved, uncertain, nervous, like someone who didn't belong. Max didn't bark, he didn't growl, but Joe could feel the change in the air, the stillness, the recognition. Max's body shifted forward slightly, protective now, not fearful. The man looked up, his eyes scanning the road, and then he stopped too, his gaze locked on Max. Something flickered in his face, shock, guilt, maybe even hope, and then he spoke. Max, his voice cracked, raspy, and unsure, like someone reaching out to a memory they weren't sure still existed. Joe's heart thudded. Max didn't move. His tail, which had just moments ago swayed with calm, now stood stiff and still. Then slowly, a low guttural growl began to build in Max's throat, deep and fierce, unlike anything Joe had heard from him before. Joe instinctively reached down and placed a steady hand on Max's back, not to restrain, but to reassure. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure it was. The man took a step forward. "Max, it's me. Don't you remember me?" His voice was softer now, but there was something behind it that made Joe uneasy. Desperation maybe, or shame. Max's growl grew louder, his body moved subtly, positioning himself slightly in front of Joe, just enough to show where his loyalty stood. Joe's chest tightened. This wasn't just any man, this was the man, Alan, Max's former owner, the one who had caused those scars, the one who had turned a loving pup into a shadow of himself. And Max knew it. He remembered not just the voice, but the scent, the stance, the way the man's hand twitched slightly when he reached out. Alan stepped closer again, a broken smile on his face. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I didn't know where you went." Joe took a step back, hand still resting on Max's back. "You need to stop right there," he said firmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Max barked once, sharp, loud, full of warning. It echoed through the quiet street like a shot. Alan froze, startled. "I didn't come to hurt him," he said quickly. I thought he was gone. I lost everything. I was a mess back then. I didn't mean." He stopped himself, as if the words caught in his throat. Joe could feel Max trembling now, not in fear, but in readiness. His muscles were tight, his breathing heavy. Joe realized in that moment that Max wasn't the same helpless dog who had once been beaten and left hungry. He was different now, stronger, loved, and he wasn't going to let that man take anything from him again. Joe's voice was calm, but unshakable. "You need to go." Alan looked at Max again. "He's mine," he said, but his voice cracked. "He was always mine." Joe didn't respond. He didn't have to. Max did. With a sudden bark, Max stepped forward, not lunging, not attacking, but placing himself fully between Joe and Alan, standing like a guard. The message was clear. This man was not welcome. Joe didn't flinch. He stood tall beside Max, silent. Alan looked at them both for a long moment, then lowered his eyes. "I'll leave," he said quietly, backing away, hands raised in surrender. "I didn't mean to scare anyone." As he turned and walked away, Joe didn't take his eyes off him, neither did Max. They stood there in the middle of the street, watching until the figure disappeared around the corner, leaving nothing but silence behind. Joe knelt slowly beside Max, heart still pounding. "You okay, buddy?" he whispered, his hand hovering just over Max's shoulder. For a second, Max didn't move. Then he let out a deep exhale and leaned gently into Joe's side. Joe didn't need any more reassurance. In that moment, they were more than man and dog. They were partners, protectors, family. Joe held him close, letting the fear melt into quiet pride. Max had faced his past and stood tall. That night, Joe locked the shop a little earlier. He kept Max close, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that pain sometimes comes back when we least expect it. He made Max's bed extra warm,
gave him his favorite scraps, and sat beside him longer than usual. Max didn't seem shaken, but there was a tiredness in his eyes, like someone who had looked into a dark room and chosen not to go inside. Joe respected that. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there, letting Max rest his head near his feet, both of them breathing in the safety of that moment. The past had knocked on their door, but this time, it had been turned away. Together.
When the police finally arrived at Joe's home, the tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate. Joe's hands trembled as he explained the ordeal with Max, the countless nights spent nursing his injured dog back to health, the way Max's eyes had looked at him, filled with pain, but also with a glimmer of hope. Joe had always believed that love and care could heal wounds, but now that belief was being tested by the cold reality of the law. The officer listened carefully, and then advised Joe to have Max microchipped for his own protection, a suggestion that should have brought relief, but instead sparked a new wave of confusion and despair. When they scanned Max, the officer's expression turned grave. The microchip was there, but the registration was under a name Joe didn't expect to hear again. Alan, the man who had abandoned Max, who had turned his back on the dog when life got too difficult. Joe's heart sank as the legal nightmare unfolded before him. The authorities were clear. Ownership could not be decided by who cared more, but by who the law recognized. The microchip tied Max to Alan, making Joe's claim tenuous at best. Suddenly, the years of quiet devotion Joe had poured into Max seemed fragile and invisible. Alan's lawyer wasted no time, sending a stern letter demanding Max be returned immediately, threatening legal action if Joe didn't comply. The letter was cold, impersonal, but it cut deeper than any knife. Joe reread the words over and over, the weight of injustice pressing down on his chest. How could a man who had abandoned Max now demand him back, treating the dog like a mere possession, rather than a living being with feelings and a history? Joe's nights grew restless, filled with visions of losing Max, of the dog being dragged away from the only home he had known in months, back to a man who had never shown him kindness. Friends and neighbors offered support, but no one could shield Joe from the impending storm of court dates, lawyer fees and paperwork. Every time Joe looked into Max's trusting eyes, he felt a fierce determination rising inside him, not just to fight for custody, but to protect the bond that had formed through shared pain and healing. Joe began researching animal custody laws, reaching out to advocacy groups, and gathering medical records that detailed Max's injuries and the care he had received. The story wasn't just about ownership, it was about Max's well-being, about ensuring he stayed with someone who truly loved and cared for him. Meanwhile, Alan's side painted a different picture, claims that Joe had taken Max without permission, accusations of theft and neglect prior to Joe's intervention. The media caught wind of the story, and soon the small town was divided. Some sympathized with Joe's fight, moved by the tale of a dog saved from abuse. Others sided with Alan, citing legal rights and property laws. The courtroom became a battleground where emotions ran high, and the simplest facts were dissected and debated. Joe felt overwhelmed but refused to give up. He recounted every moment he had spent caring for Max, the sleepless nights, the vet visits, the painstaking rehabilitation that gave Max a second chance at life. Alan, sitting on the opposite side, seemed detached, his words measured and cold. Joe's lawyer argued passionately that Max was more than a pet, he was family, and to return him to Alan would be to condemn the dog to a life of uncertainty and fear. The judge listened intently, aware that the case was about more than just a microchip or a legal document. It was about justice, compassion and what it truly meant to care for an animal. After days of hearings, testimony from veterinarians, animal behaviorists and witnesses, the verdict was finally delivered. The court recognized Joe's role in Max's recovery, and allowed him to keep custody, with conditions for Alan to have supervised visitation. It wasn't a perfect ending. Joe knew the fight had taken its toll on everyone involved, especially Max, who seemed to sense the tension, even without understanding the words spoken around him. But it was a victory, a testament to the power of love and resilience in the face of adversity. Joe held Max close, tears streaming down his face as the weight of relief settled over him. The battle was over, but the scars remained, a reminder that sometimes,
Doing what's right means standing up against the odds, even when the world seems determined to pull you apart. And through it all, Max was there, his silent, loyal companion, proof that hope and heart can sometimes outshine the harshest laws.
As the court date loomed closer, Joe found himself swallowed by a mixture of anxiety and determination, the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders heavier than ever before. He wasn't alone in this fight. Rachel, a sharp and compassionate lawyer, had stepped in to guide him through the complex legal maze, bringing hope that justice might finally prevail. Alongside Rachel was Karen, Joe's steadfast friend from the shelter, whose belief in Joe's cause never wavered, and who tirelessly helped gather every shred of evidence they could find. Together they sifted through stacks of vet records detailing the injuries Max had suffered before Joe's intervention, each page a heartbreaking testament to the dog's suffering and resilience. Witness statements from neighbors and friends who had noticed Max's condition or Alan's neglect began to paint a clearer picture of the truth. Karen, ever the organizer, compiled a photo album showing Max's journey from the frightened, injured dog Joe had found to the healthier, happier companion he was becoming under Joe's care. These visual proofs spoke louder than words, capturing moments of tenderness and recovery that no court document could deny. Days melted into nights as Joe and Rachel strategized over how best to present the case, preparing to face not only the law, but the cold indifference of Alan's legal team, who would undoubtedly try to twist facts to their advantage. Just when hope seemed to flicker faintly, a new twist emerged that none of them had expected. Emily, Alan's niece, came forward with a confession that shook the entire case to its core. She had watched from the sidelines for years, powerless and afraid to speak out, but witnessing Max's rescue had finally given her courage. Emily's voice trembled as she recounted moments she had seen, the abuse Alan inflicted on Max hidden behind closed doors. What she brought with her was irrefutable, a video recording capturing the harsh treatment Max endured, footage that stripped away any pretense of innocence Alan's side had tried to maintain. The video was raw and painful to watch, showing Max trembling, his eyes wide with fear, and Alan's rough hands, striking without mercy. It was a devastating revelation, but also a powerful weapon in Joe's quest for justice. Rachel immediately recognized the impact this evidence would have in court, knowing that it could tip the scales and expose the harsh reality that Max had endured. Joe was overwhelmed. Part relief, part sorrow for the trauma Max had suffered was now undeniable. Yet, Emily's courage gave him renewed strength. Together they worked to ensure the evidence was admissible, consulting with experts to verify its authenticity and preparing Emily to testify. The coming days were a whirlwind of preparation, with Joe leaning on Karen's unwavering support to keep his spirits from breaking. He spent quiet moments with Max, brushing his fur and whispering promises that no matter what happened, he would protect him. The community around them rallied as well, many touched by the story of a dog fighting for a second chance. Petitions were signed, and messages of encouragement poured in, reminding Joe that he was not alone. Still the fear lingered. Court was a battlefield, and the outcome uncertain. Alan's team was relentless, trying to discredit Emily and paint Joe as an intruder who had taken what was not his. But the truth held a powerful light, shining through every testimony and every piece of evidence presented. The courtroom was tense on the day of the hearing, emotions running high as Rachel methodically laid out the case. Emily's testimony was raw and heartfelt, her voice steady despite the pain of reliving the past. She spoke not only for Max, but for all those who suffer in silence, her bravery echoing through the room. Joe sat beside Max, who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, his eyes meeting Joe's with trust and quiet hope. As the proceedings unfolded, Joe realized that this battle was about more than just a dog. It was about fighting for what is right, for compassion in a world that can often be cruel and indifferent. Through every challenge, every setback, Joe held on to the belief that love and truth would prevail. And as the final arguments were made, and the judge prepared to deliberate, Joe felt a deep sense of gratitude for Rachel's guidance, Karen's friendship, Emily's courage, and most of all for Max, whose silent strength inspired him to never give up. Whatever the outcome, Joe knew they had already won something invaluable, the chance to stand up for the voiceless, and to fight with every ounce of their being for justice and hope. The day of the courtroom battle arrived with a tension so thick, It seemed to fill every corner of the room, where everyone from Joe to the judge, the lawyers, and even Max himself felt the heavy weight of what was at stake. Joe sat quietly beside Rachel, his lawyer, whose calm confidence and heartfelt passion had been the backbone of their fight from the start. Rachel rose to speak with a steady voice that carried the strength of all the months they had spent preparing, all the nights spent gathering evidence, and hoping for a chance to prove what Joe already knew deep down, that Max belonged with him. She spoke not only as a lawyer, but as a voice for the voiceless, for the dog who could not tell his own story, but whose suffering had been captured in every photo, every vet report, every witness statement, and that damning video Emily had bravely brought forward. The courtroom was silent as Rachel laid out the truth in clear, simple terms, connecting the dots that Alan's legal team desperately tried to obscure with lies and distraction. Alan himself sat across the room, his face tightening with frustration each time a piece of evidence further dismantled the story he had tried to construct. Witness after witness testified, each story weaving a tapestry of neglect and pain, but also of hope and healing, of a dog saved from darkness by a man who had given everything to help him recover. Emily's testimony was a moment that seemed to pause time itself, her voice unwavering as she described the abuse she had witnessed, her eyes shining with the courage it had taken to speak out against her own family. The video played again, its images impossible to ignore, showing Max's fear and pain in stark, heartbreaking detail. As Rachel finished her argument, she appealed not to legal technicalities, but to the heart of justice and compassion, asking the judge to recognize the bond between Joe and Max, a bond forged in love and sacrifice. The judge listened carefully, weighing the evidence, the words and the emotions filling the room. After what felt like an eternity, the ruling came, a decision that Max would remain with Joe. The room exhaled, as if the very air had been holding its breath, a collective relief washing over those who had stood by Joe and Max through every hardship. Tears sprang to Joe's eyes as he looked down at Max, who wagged his tail gently, sensing the victory that had been fought so hard. The judge's words were clear and just, affirming that Max's well-being and happiness belonged with Joe, the man who had shown unwavering devotion and kindness. But even in this moment of triumph, the shadow of Alan's anger loomed. He left the courtroom with clenched fists and a promise of revenge, his voice cold and threatening, a warning that the battle might not be over. Joe felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had won the right to keep Max, but he knew that the scars from this fight would take time to heal, and the threat of Alan's bitterness could bring new challenges. Still surrounded by Rachel, Karen and the supporters who had never doubted him, Joe found strength in knowing that he had done everything possible to protect Max. The community, moved by the story and the courage shown by everyone involved, rallied behind Joe, offering help and encouragement to face whatever might come next. Joe's heart swelled with gratitude as he realized that this victory was not just his own, it belonged to everyone who believed in standing up for what is right, who fought for those who cannot fight for themselves. As Max rested his head on Joe's knee, the future seemed uncertain but filled with hope, a hope born from love, justice, and the promise that sometimes, even against the darkest odds, good can prevail. And in that courtroom where truth had finally spoken louder than lies, everyone who witnessed the battle knew they had seen something powerful, proof that compassion and courage could change lives, heal wounds, and create a new beginning for a dog who deserved nothing less than to be loved and safe. After the courtroom victory, Joe hoped that the worst was behind him, that finally, he and Max could begin to heal and rebuild their lives in peace. But the shadows of fear soon crept back in, with a chilling persistence that neither Joe nor Max could ignore. Strange cars began appearing near Joe's small shop, their windows dark and tinted, engines idling just long enough to be noticed, but without any clear purpose. Joe would catch glimpses of figures watching from behind the curtains, their faces hidden, their intentions unclear but unmistakably hostile. One evening, Joe arrived at the shop to find the front window shattered, Glass scattered across the floor like broken promises, cold air rushing in, where safety had once stood. The damage was a cruel reminder that Alan's promise of revenge was no empty threat. Night after night, Joe lay awake listening for suspicious sounds, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios, yet he refused to let panic take hold. The most terrifying moment came on a dark, stormy night, when Joe smelled smoke before he even stepped out of bed, the acrid stench curling through the air like a sinister warning. Rushing to the shop, he found the rear door had been forced open, and a small fire had been set, smoke billowing and licking at the walls, threatening to consume everything Joe had worked so hard to protect. Max was there by his side, barking fiercely, his alertness a steady beacon amid chaos, warning Joe of the danger, and refusing to leave his side. Joe's heart pounded with fear, but also with a fierce determination to fight back against this creeping darkness. The fire was contained before it could do irreparable harm, thanks to quick action from the local fire department and the vigilance of neighbors who had come running when they heard the alarm. But the message was clear: this was not just about a dog or a court case anymore. It was a personal war, a test of endurance and courage. Joe knew he had to act decisively. He fortified the shop, installing sturdy locks, security cameras, and bright floodlights that pierced the night like watchful eyes. He called in favors from friends and the community, who rallied around him, offering support and sharing their own fears and stories of standing up to intimidation. Yet, despite all the protection, the fear lingered like a cold shadow, slipping into the quiet moments when Joe felt alone and vulnerable. Max, ever vigilant, seemed to sense Joe's exhaustion, resting his head gently on Joe's lap, offering silent comfort without judgment or complaint. Joe was tired, his body ached from sleepless nights, his mind burdened with worries about what the future held. But deep inside, a flame burned brighter than the threats that loomed outside, an unyielding resolve that no amount of fear or violence could extinguish. Joe refused to let darkness dictate his life or rob him of the peace he and Max deserved. He thought of all they had been through, the pain, the fight, the long journey toward justice, and realized that each challenge only made their bond stronger, their purpose clearer. He would keep fighting, not just for himself or Max, but for everyone who needed to know that courage could stand firm even when shadows lengthened and threats grew louder. Together Joe and Max faced each day with quiet strength, ready to protect what they had earned, and to keep hope alive, knowing that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought in courtrooms, but in the resilience of the human and canine spirit standing tall against the night. One cold, quiet night, as Joe was locking up his shop after another long day, marked by worry and sleeplessness, he noticed a figure huddled behind the dumpster, shivering, trembling, and trying hard not to be seen. Moving closer, Joe found a teenage boy, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, wrapped in a worn jacket that barely protected him from the biting chill. The boy introduced himself as Evan and claimed he was homeless, searching for shelter and safety in the unforgiving night. Joe's heart ached at the sight of this lost child, vulnerable and alone. But as they talked more, the truth began to unravel slowly, like a fragile thread pulled from a tangled knot. Evan didn't just survive on the streets. He had a darker past, one that tied him directly to Alan, the man who had brought so much pain into Joe and Max's lives. Evan confessed that he had once worked for Alan, not by choice, but because he had been forced into the cruel world of Alan's dogfighting ring, a place where suffering and fear were everyday realities, and innocence was stolen, far too young. Joe listened, his fists clenched tightly as Evan spoke of the horrors he had witnessed: dogs beaten into submission, the sick cruelty of the fights, and the way Alan ruled with an iron fist, demanding obedience and silence. Evan's voice cracked with the weight of memories, tears spilling down his cheeks, as he admitted how trapped and hopeless he had felt, a boy caught in a nightmare from which he saw no escape. But now, something had changed. Something stronger than fear had begun to grow inside Evan. He wanted to break free, to fight back,
to help stop Alan from hurting any more innocent lives, whether human or animal. Joe saw in Evan not just a victim, but a spark of courage, a young person who had found the strength to speak truth against cruelty, despite the danger it posed. It reminded Joe of his own fight with Alan, the long road from despair to hope, and the belief that even the smallest light could banish the deepest darkness. They formed an unspoken bond that night, two souls connected by pain, by the will to protect, and by a shared desire for justice. Joe offered Evan a safe place to stay, a chance to heal, and most importantly a way to be part of something bigger than himself, a fight against cruelty and injustice that had already changed the lives of so many. Together, they began to plan carefully, knowing that Alan would not take kindly to betrayal or defiance. Evan shared what little he could remember about Alan's operations, the secret locations where dogs were kept, the times when fights were held, and the people involved, all dangerous knowledge but crucial to bringing Alan down once and for all. Joe, with Rachel and Karen by his side, listened and strategized, preparing to use Evan's courage and information to build a case that would finally expose Alan's darkest deeds to the world. The road ahead was perilous, filled with threats and uncertainty, but Joe felt a renewed sense of purpose, fueled by Evan's bravery and Max's steady companionship. Together, they were no longer just survivors, they were fighters, determined to end the cycle of pain and fear that had shadowed their lives for too long. In Evan, Joe saw not just a boy in trouble but a symbol of hope and redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest places, light can find a way to shine through. And as the days passed, with Evan slowly gaining strength and trust, Joe knew that their fight was far from over, but now, they were stronger, united by a bond forged in adversity, and an unbreakable will to protect those who could not protect themselves.
With every passing day, the urgency to bring Alan's cruel dogfighting ring to justice grew stronger in Joe's heart, fueled by Evan's painful memories and their shared determination to protect innocent lives. Together, they crafted a careful plan, one that required stealth, courage, and a deep trust in each other, and of course, the ever-loyal Max, whose keen senses and unwavering presence gave them hope and strength. The night they chose to act was heavy with tension. Shadows lengthened as the three crept toward Alan's warehouse, a grim fortress hidden behind a veil of secrecy and silence. Every step was measured, every breath held as they navigated through darkness, aware that discovery could mean danger beyond what they had ever faced. Max led the way, his nose twitching and ears alert, sensing unseen threats lurking in the cold night air. Inside, the warehouse was a haunting reminder of the cruelty they had vowed to end. Cages lined up like tombs, echoes of suffering hanging in the stale air, and the faint smell of fear and neglect seeping from the walls. But their mission was clear. They moved swiftly, searching for anything that could expose Alan and his network, their eyes scanning piles of papers, locked cabinets, and hidden drawers. And then, after what felt like an eternity of silent search, they found it, the damning evidence they needed, detailed records documenting dogfights, names of participants and buyers, photographs of injured animals and violent events, and even ledgers showing the money exchanged to keep the gruesome operation running. Joe's hands trembled as he gathered the files, the weight of proof they held promising an end to the nightmare that had haunted so many. But time was against them. The sound of footsteps echoed from a distant corridor, sharp and growing louder, a warning that Alan's men were returning. Panic threatened to rise, but Joe, Evan and Max kept their focus, escaping through narrow back passages and hidden exits, their hearts pounding with fear and hope intertwined. Once safe, Joe contacted the police, turning over the evidence that would crack the case wide open. The authorities wasted no time, organizing a raid on Alan's network that sent shockwaves through the community, breaking the chains of cruelty that had bound so many helpless animals. Those responsible were arrested, faces once hidden in darkness now exposed under the harsh light of justice. The relief was overwhelming but tinged with sadness for the damage that had been done,
the lives harmed and the trust shattered. Yet amidst the sorrow, a powerful sense of victory filled Joe and Evan's hearts. They had done more than gather evidence. They had reclaimed dignity for the victims and hope for a future free from fear. Max, ever faithful, seemed to sense the change too, his tail wagging as if celebrating alongside his companion. Their journey had been long and painful, marked by fear, uncertainty and struggle, but in breaking the ring they had forged a path to healing and redemption. Joe thought of all they had sacrificed, all the nights spent planning and fearing, and knew that every moment had been worth it. For Evan, it was a chance to start anew away from the shadows of his past, with the support of people who believed in second chances. And for Joe, it was proof that love and courage could triumph over cruelty, that one man, one dog, and one brave boy could make a difference in a world too often blind to suffering. As the sun rose, casting light on a day filled with promise, Joe looked at Max and Evan, feeling a deep gratitude and hope that no matter what came next, they would face it together, stronger, united and ready to protect those who needed them most.
After the long, grueling battle against cruelty and darkness, Joe's shop transformed into something extraordinary, a true haven, a sanctuary where rescued animals found safety, love, and a chance to heal from wounds, both seen and unseen. The little shop that had once been a place of business became a beacon of hope in the community, its walls echoing with the joyful sounds of barking dogs, chirping birds, and the soft purrs of cats, who had finally found a home. Evan, the brave boy who had come into Joe's life like a fragile light in a storm, stayed by his side, dedicating himself to caring for the animals and helping others understand the importance of kindness and protection. Together they worked tirelessly, building not just shelters and cages, but bonds of trust and healing, teaching those who came to visit about compassion, respect, and the strength that comes from standing up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And at the heart of this haven was Max, the dog who had once been broken, who had suffered pain and fear that no creature should endure, but who now carried the proud title of symbol of hope and resilience. Max's gentle eyes and wagging tail welcomed children who came to play, his laughter ringing through the air as little hands reached out to touch his soft fur, while strangers from near and far sent donations, moved by the story of a dog who had survived against all odds, and a man who had never given up on him. The community rallied around Joe and Evan, inspired by their courage and the tangible change they had brought, not only saving animals, but changing hearts and minds. This movement grew beyond the shop, spreading into local schools, community centers, and eventually catching the attention of lawmakers, who realized that real change was necessary to protect animals from cruelty and neglect. New laws were proposed and passed, strengthening punishments for those who harmed animals, and supporting rescue and rehabilitation efforts like Joe. In the golden light of a peaceful evening, when the sun cast long shadows and bathed the world in warmth, Joe would often sit quietly, watching Max resting contentedly at his feet. Those moments were precious and full of meaning. With a soft voice, sometimes barely a whisper, Joe would look down at Max and say, "You saved us all." It wasn't just a tribute to the dog who had endured so much, but a recognition of the way Max's survival had inspired change, hope and healing far beyond what anyone had imagined. The scars that remained on Max's body and soul were now reminders of battles fought and won, of a journey from darkness to light that touched countless lives. Joe's heart swelled with gratitude for the friends and strangers who had stood by them, the lawyers, the neighbors, the witnesses, and the quiet heroes who had believed in justice and compassion. Together they had created more than a sanctuary. They had sparked a movement that would continue long after the echoes of their struggle faded, ensuring that no other dog or child would face the horrors that Max and Evan once did. The shop was filled with life, hope, and the promise of a better tomorrow, a place where every rescued animal could find their own chance to start over, just as Max had. And in those quiet golden evenings, as Joe looked at the dog who had changed his world, he knew that their story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a legacy of love, courage, and unwavering hope.